Good morning, students. Today we look at the chapter that is gender, the topic that is the gender literacy and culture. Now, we had seen yesterday how Roman Empire, which once spread from one part of Europe to the other, then almost the whole of North Africa, then great part of Asia, all of all those geographies were now coming under tremendous amount of strain and uh, people and especially the tribes from northern part of Europe had now started compressing the Romans and people and the tribes from the other geographies like in the northern part of Africa also they had started now raising their voice and they had now started picking up conflicts with the Roman army. So it was becoming extremely difficult for the Romans and the Roman army to really maintain all this peace and this administrative setup, which was much beyond the common and the average rulers. Students, I have always said this during my videos that it is very nice that when a geography stretches for thousands of kilometers under a particular emperor or a particular empire, of course it brings in great amount of resources, gold, you have so much of talent, there's so many urban settlements, there's so much of prosperity, hundreds and thousands of people living. All that is fine. The empire becomes extremely powerful, huge standing army, everyone is so afraid of, and everyone looks at you with so much of awe. But you have to understand these kind of setups can be maintained only when the king or the emperor, whether in Rome or in India or in Mongol Empire or in the Arab world, wherever for that matter, these kind of setups work only when you have an emperor or the king or the queen who is extremely able, someone who is extremely charismatic, someone who's very brave, and in most of the cases, if you have to be a great general as well, so that your opponents also respect and fear you. So all this thing is extremely important to maintain huge empires uh, and to ensure their stability. But now, as we saw yesterday, that all that was slipping out for the Romans because in just by around 200 AD to 300 AD, they had become so politically fragile and unstable that there had been 25 emperors in just 47 years. So, one emperor is not even able to rule for 6 months on average. Right, so imagine, it sounds very grand, a title like he's an emperor and an emperor, but then he's barely there for 5 months and 6 months. So the situation had come to such a pass whereby no Roman family or no Roman family from the ruling elite was able to come up with someone who was able, someone who was a great administrator, someone who could actually hold this enormous uh, complexity, who could handle this enormous complexity of such huge and diverse geographies and diverse cultures, different people from different backgrounds. So this is not a mean feat, and naturally now Rome was not able to produce men of those great talents like Julius Caesar and Augustus and those kind of people. All of them were gone. Now uh, the only thing that Rome was able to provide was just a bunch of mediocres, and that's what we saw. So today we would talk about gender, literacy, and culture. One of the most modern features of Roman society was the widespread prevalence of the nuclear family. That adult sons did not live with their families, and it was exceptional for adult brothers to share a common household. And on the other hand, slaves were included in the family as the Romans understood this. By the late Republic, that's the first century before Christ, the typical form of marriage was one where the wife did not transfer to her husband's authority but retained full rights in the property of her natal family. Natal family would mean essentially your family of birth. While the woman's dowry went to the husband for the duration of the marriage, the woman remained a primary heir to her father and became an independent property owner on her father's death. Thus, Roman women enjoyed considerable legal rights in owning and managing property. Students, this is something quite remarkable. This existed more than 2,000 years ago in Roman society. Something which many societies and many countries around the world even today have not been able to give their women what Romans were able to give them um, more than 2,000 years ago. Okay, things like share in the property of the father. That is something which we were able to do it just about 15, 20 years ago, and many societies around the world still find it hard to give this. And one very important thing was, of course, women had the power of they didn't have to go through a great deal of complexity if they want a divorce from their husbands, like it is still there in many societies. But these things depend from culture to culture. You'll have to understand, like in India we have, or in even Japan for that matter, or China for that matter, we have a very conservative culture, because we happen to be extremely old civilizations. So it is not very easy for us to just shrug all that off at one go or with the stroke of a pen. But you have to understand one thing which Romans were remarkable, because it was not something that was cultural. That actually shows their quality of being a good human. The Roman society being benevolent, Roman society being, uh, mm, you know, definitely a society which was based on merit, which is about the treatment of slaves. You have to understand that at that point in time, when we are talking about 2000 years ago, slavery was prevalent all across the world, almost. Not to that extent in India, but then definitely in great many parts of the world, slavery was very prevalent. But the Romans, unlike many other societies and civilizations who did not treat slaves nicely, and forget about nicely, I take this word back, no, they were not even considered humans. But Romans, there are records where Romans used to be extremely nice to their slaves. Of course, you would always have people within a society who would not conform to it, and they were brutal and extremely harsh against the slaves, but and treated them very unfairly. But at the same point of time, you'll also have to. There are numerous accounts of Rome and in Roman civilization where if the slaves were had merit, the slaves could. There were slaves who were philosophers. There were slaves who were mathematicians. It is not that just a slave meant a servant who was probably cleaning your household and taking care of your children. No, there were slaves who there are accounts of slaves who were men of medicine, and they were actually considered part of the family. And there are many accounts where if the slaves had been when the rich man died or when their owners died, they also allocated a certain amount of property to in their will for these slaves. So it was not that slavery was such a bad institution after all. For Rome, the slaves were treated far better in the Roman Empire, where compared to anywhere else. The master could be surely bad, but definitely this is something which is very remarkable about the Roman Empire, because you have to understand, as we had seen right in the beginning of the chapter, that this was one of the major differences between the Persian Empire, that is the Iranian Empire, and the Roman Empire. That is, Roman Empire was about a great deal of diversity compared to what Persian Empire was about. And that's the reason why the Roman emperors understood that they would be having Negroes, they would be having North Africans, Egyptians, people from England, people from France, people from all across. right? Asia, so much of diversity. If they now start only talking about Romans and Italians and Romans, then they will not be able to be prosperous enough. And this was, in fact, the same thing. This was the same thing which was followed by even the Mongols. When Mongols had occupied half of the planet, even under them, the slaves were given received fair treatment. Even under Mongols, the slaves could rise very high within the ranks. Slaves could be great generals, and the same used to be in Roman Empire. There were slaves who rose very high in the Roman army, and they used to be generals. And because they had that capability, they were brave, fiercely loyal people, and they were promoted in the Roman army. Not that they were only confined to the dungeons. No, that is not true. And this is something which is very unique to the Romans. And if you read about the Mongols, it was very unique to the Mongols as well, because they also treated the slaves very fairly, and they promoted them. And the slaves were always considered part of their own family. They were never considered, that they should be confined to the garbage bin. No, nothing like that. Now, as we have already seen, that women definitely enjoyed far greater powers in terms of the social powers, and they had far greater freedom and independence when it came to a lot of decisions. And these things are actually remarkable about sharing property and the with the in the father's property, having a share in the father's property, that is. And then things like divorce, and they could have businesses as well. And marriages were generally arranged, and there is no doubt that women were often subject to domination by their husbands. Augustine, the great Catholic bishop who spent most of his life in North Africa, that tells that his mother was regularly beaten up by his father. Now, students, this is something which is not that. This is something which happens even today. Women sometimes being treated unfairly by their husbands, but then even the husbands being treated unfairly by their wives. So now that is something which is which is a part of human nature. You can't say that the system is faulty, because the men are equally being treated unfairly by women in different relationships, and women are also being treated unfairly. So it is not that the government is asking them to treat the men unfairly, or the women unfairly. It is just that's how human beings are. Now, everything cannot be taken as a right or a wrong. That is that the society being unjust, and no, that would be, of course, if the society doesn't make laws to make those things illegal, then there is a problem. But then you cannot really stop these activities, and should not jump to historical conclusions about them. By and large, the Roman society was, at least it tried to balance the interests of varied section of the society and the population. Okay, we shall continue. Thanks.